Hey Monster Hunters, if you're enjoying Beast and Bible, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and don't forget to share it with somebody who might like it. Now, on to the show.
The Investigative News Group presents the Geraldo Rivera Special. Devil Worship. Exposing Satan's Underground.
Whether a Satan exists is a matter of belief, but we are certain that Satanism exists. To some, it's a religion. To others, it's the practice of evil in the devil's name. It exists, and it's flourishing. Members of our studio audience tonight will attest to that. They are friends and foes of Satanism, devil worshippers and law enforcers, experts and victims. They'll help us understand this force that exalts evil and darkness. We'll be asking why. Why does it exist? And why does it appeal to so many vulnerable people, especially the young? Now, the very young and the impressionable should definitely not be watching this program tonight. This is not a Halloween fable.
When the Geraldo Rivera Show aired its special on Satanism in 1988, the panic was at its peak. Thousands of homes tuned in to get the tea on what everyone knew to be an orchestrated underground movement of Satanists targeting our children. The episode was produced in a tabloid style that divided journalists and framed its questions to its guests, including Ozzy Osbourne, in ways that would put anyone on the defensive and make them look guilty. Geraldo validated all manner of spurious claims as fact. In 1995, Rivera went on record to apologize for his role in propagating the panic, particularly as it relates to the McMartin daycare trial, which we will discuss later in this episode. The book, The Daycare Ritual Abuse Moral Panic by Mary DeYoung, records the apology. In a segment of his show called Wrongly Accused and Convicted of Child Molest, Rivera says, "I want to announce publicly that as a firm believer of the Believe the Children movement of the 1980s that started with the McMartin trials in California, I am now convinced I was terribly wrong, and many innocent people were convicted and sent to prison as a result, and I am also convinced that the memory therapy movement is also a bunch of crap." End quote. The memory therapy movement, described in Michelle Remembers, is an unethical methodology that's no longer practiced as it ended up implanting false memories in its victims. Lawrence Pasdar, the psychologist who helped, and helped is in quotation marks, Michelle remember her satanic abuse and later left his wife and married his client Michelle, who should have told people all they needed to know, helped promote this method of recovering memories. However, in the 1990s, Pasdar indicated in the Daily Mail that it didn't really matter if her story was true as long as it felt real to her. It mattered to other people, though, as many investigations revealed that almost all of the claims Michelle remembered were false. The 1980s were wild, and it's good to welcome you back to our interview about them with Dr. Joseph Laycock from Texas State University, and the final welcome to the final episode of our first podcast season. The same content warning applies to this episode as the last one, as we talk about mental health and suicide. And as always, if you are struggling or know someone who is, there is hope. Please dial 988 and let the Suicide Prevention and Crisis Hotline be a resource for you. This episode is entitled Panic Attack Part 2, How the Satanic Panic Turned Us into Monsters. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Right. No, it's wild to think about how far this stuff can go once it takes hold and how people can build their careers off of it. There was another story, and I'm blanking on the name, but there was a detective who investigated another young man who died by suicide and went through like the tunnels, the steam tunnels underneath the college, and basically fabricated a link to Dungeons and Dragons. I think they wrote a book. They kind of did the same thing, went on tour, and then even later basically kind of said it doesn't matter if it was true or not. I can't remember. Do you, up the top of you remember the name in that story?
Yeah, so this was Dallas Egbert. Similar to Bank Pulling, had a lot of other stuff going on, and they singled in on Dungeons and Dragons. So Dallas Egbert started college when he was 16, so he was a prodigy. He was gay, but not out. In 1979, he was manufacturing his own drugs in his dorm room.
Never a good thing.
Yeah. And he had played Dungeons and Dragons at least a little bit, but I think the group had asked him not to come back because he was high. And so he disappears, and his family was wealthy, so they hire a private detective named William Deere. William Deere is still alive and a very strange guy. So after this case, he was involved in, if anyone remembers the 90s, there was the Alien Autopsy show. So he was involved in trying to determine if this video of an alien being dissected was authentic or not. He wrote a book relatively recently called O.J. Simpson is Innocent and I Can Prove It. So he's just drawn to anything kind of controversial where he can sort of get some attention. And he became obsessed with this theory that Dallas Egbert had sort of become lost in this game of fantasy and had wandered into these steam tunnels that existed underneath his college. And he gave a big press report saying this. And this, by the way, did great sales for Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons has only been around for 5 years, and suddenly everyone heard, I hear it's so intense you will lose your mind playing it. Eventually, Dallas...
I mentioned this on another podcast episode where we think that these sensational accounts or even banning something will somehow get rid of it, and it 9 times out of 10 has the opposite effect, where you've given it a stigma, you've made it dangerous, and then immediately it does even better. So it doesn't do what you want it to do.
Absolutely. I mean, this happens with Ouija boards and warning labels on albums and so many other things. But Dallas Egbert ended up near New Orleans and just called his parents and said, I'm ready to come home. And they sent William Deere to go collect him.
Dr. Laycock shared how not long after William Deere went to retrieve Dallas, Dallas died by suicide. Then Deere decided to profit off this tragedy by writing a novel.
But William Deere wrote a book called The Dungeon Master years later, where he's sort of describing his investigation and still kind of, acting as if his theory was somehow correct. And this also became the basis of the movie Mazes and Monsters, which I already mentioned. So that's a movie I'm sure Tom Hanks wishes everyone would forget about.
Tom Hanks and his friends get caught up in a deadly game of fantasy.
I am the maze controller.
Until they take it too far.
I propose we play Mazes and Monsters in a real setting. It won't be a fantasy.
Too bad for one of them, because now there's no turning back.
This is only a game.
I know I killed somebody.
Mazes and Monsters.
But you can go see Tom Hanks believing that he's a D&D character.
Right before David S. Pumpkins was famous, we had this.
Right. I mean, Tom Hanks has done a lot of really great movies, but this is one of the first things he ever did, and he is just wandering around, New York, and he sees the subway and thinks it's a dragon and this kind of stuff, and that all comes from William Deere's sort of bizarre theory of a disappeared college student.
So several evangelists, so kind of pulling it back into a media ministry context, several evangelists lent their voices to the panic and started spreading false information. Do you have 1 or 2 stories about that? I mean, I remember being a kid and being in Bible classes at church and watching these really frightening videos about, I think Dungeons and Dragons was mentioned, heavy metal was mentioned, and of course there's obviously very openly, there's some people who go the satanic route for an aesthetic and shock value, then there's clearly bands that are very openly, occultish, but this was presented in a way that was very sensational, meant to really terrify people. There's even a TikTok account called Satanic Panic at the Disco that sort of features little clips from the 80s where they're dissecting everything from Rainbow Bright cereal to action figures to everything. But I remember growing up in the church and hearing and seeing some of these things. Do you have any stories about maybe evangelists who use this fear and paranoia and panic to capitalize?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of 2 levels to this. On the one hand, you have kind of pastors and parents who just sort of heard things and they're concerned. But you have another level of people who, frankly, appear to be mentally ill, who were making these absolutely wild claims. So one of these would be Eric Schnobelen, or I'd say William Schnobelen. William Schnobelen has written a bunch of books about how Wicca and the Catholic Church and Mormons and all these groups worship the devil. And he says, I know they do because I have been a member of each of these religions, right? and actually says that he was a literal vampire, that he literally, through his Satan worship, was burnt by sunlight and subsisted entirely on human blood at a time. And then when he wrote his annual check to the Church of Satan, the bank teller wrote, I'll pray for you or something, and that destroyed his vampire powers and he became human again. But he claimed that he was involved in creating Dungeons and Dragons, and that the creators, who he didn't know their names, came to him and asked for help making sure all of the black magic spells in the game were authentic and would actually work. And he said, so I know that these are real spells. I know they work because I used to be a Satanist. Another one is Rebecca Brown. Rebecca Brown wrote a book called He Came to Set the Captives Free, and critiques all sorts of things and makes the argument that basically the imagination is not real, that things either exist on a physical level or a spiritual level, but nothing is imaginary. So if you are imagining you're fighting a monster in Dungeons and Dragons, that there's a demon literally present there, right, in your mind, right? And she was a medical doctor, and she lost her license because she had a patient who she was prescribing ridiculous amounts of painkillers to and then doing exorcisms on at the hospital. So another case where these are sort of the boldest claims. Her book was used in police crime seminars, but when you actually get it, sort of what are these people like, there's a lot of evidence of pretty serious neurosis and mental illness.
That's what's so scary about this. And you've mentioned this a little bit already, but you have Christians who unknowingly get swept up in this and spread these false rumors and information. And obviously this is pre-internet. You don't have the ability to fact check everything like we can now. So they get swept up in this, and there's a lot of innocent people who get hurt, who lose their livelihood. I believe there's a story about a daycare and false accusations against child abuse. I don't know if you can share a little bit about that sad story.
Yeah, so weirdly, one of the big targets of the Satanic Panic were daycare providers. And so the McMartin preschool trial, which I think began in 1980 and went until 1987 or something like that, was at the time the longest, most expensive trial in American history.
In what may become one of the biggest child molesting cases ever on record, 7 nursery school teachers were arraigned today on more than 100 counts of child molestation.
The accused include the preschool owner, 76-year-old Virginia McMartin, her daughter, and 2 grandchildren.
Finding out just what happened to the McMartin preschoolers in Manhattan Beach, California, would spark a national media obsession.
A case which has shocked much of Southern California and caused a lot of parents to worry about the safety of their children,
setting off a panic around the country.
In alarming numbers, preschoolers have been exploited.
It began with this claim that a little mom and pop daycare operation were Satanists, that they had tunnels underneath the daycare, that they would take kids underground and torture them and somehow always have them cleaned up and ready for their parents to pick them up at the end of the school day. They excavated under the daycare. They didn't find any evidence for any of this. And one thing that we learned from the McMartin trial is if you ask leading questions to a 5-year-old, they will say all sorts of things. And then if you kind of massage the answers to where you eliminate anything that sort of seems implausible, then you can kind of get a child to say anything, right? And so the McMartins were ultimately exonerated, but it completely ruined their livelihood. One of them spent the entire 7 years in jail before they were exonerated. The same thing happened here in Austin, Texas, where I'm based. That couple, when they were accused, and it was a similar accusation, made the bad decision to flee town. So they were convicted. And again, it was things like children testified, they drove me to the cemetery and they cut out my arm bone and they put in the arm bone of the devil. Right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense, the kinds of things that are being alleged. So they were released in, I believe, 2014. And then I think finally given some compensation. But they were in prison for 20 years for crimes that not only did they not do, but never occurred. There literally was no crime here that they were being punished for. So it is odd. If I were a Satanist trying to destroy American society, I would probably work for a major corporation or perhaps governments. I wouldn't open a daycare center. So the question is, what is it about daycare providers? And David Bromley has theorized that part of this was The economy changed in the 1980s to being a two-income household is the norm. So mom and dad maybe didn't want to send their kid to daycare, but they didn't really have a choice. And so the idea that Satanists are corrupting your kids at a daycare, it felt true. Even if it wasn't literally true, there was a sense of forces we cannot control are undermining our ability to raise our children. And maybe that's why there was all this emphasis on daycares.
And that makes a lot of sense, considering, when the family structure shifts, there's anxiety. People may have grown up thinking we're going to have a very sort of traditional Western family where dad goes to work, mom stays at home with the kids. And now that's been, uprooted, destabilized. And now we have to entrust our children to these people who, are not family members. They're not a parent. And then this narrative slips right in there and just throws gasoline on the fires of our worst cultural fears, and it blows up. Another character, and I didn't mention this in the list of questions and things that we discussed, but there is another evangelical, and I hesitate to even use that word because they're such an odd duck. They've done exposés in Christianity Today. There's numerous articles about them, but Jack Chick is a character that shows up with his little horrible comics in the 80s. And I don't know if it was the 70s. I know it was the 80s for sure. And I remember seeing them as a little kid in October. They'd be all over the place. Where there was black masses, there was accusations of witchcraft, there was essentially a devil and a conspiracy and a ritual and a sacrifice on every corner, using very graphic, frightening imagery and words targeted at kids. And what I have found, as a pastor, and I listen to some contemporary speakers inside my faith tradition and outside, I will listen to things. I think that's Jack Chick. That's a Jack Chick comic that has been repackaged and presented to an audience who was completely ignorant of that whole line of thought. One of them is how the Catholic Church created Islam, and that comes right from a Jack Chick and the escaped Jesuit. Was it Francisco Rivera? And there's been exposés done on him, and so it's not even new. It's just repackaged and repackaged, but it drops at certain times, and for some reason it gets currency and it gets traction and just takes off. But maybe just a little bit for our listeners who are unfamiliar, who was Jack Chick and how did he play a role among evangelicals, Christians in the 1980s?
Yeah, so Jack Chick founded Chick Publications, and they did a number of books, but especially these little comic tracts, which people would buy and then leave at payphones and bus stops and things like that. And he actually learned that tactic from Mao. That's actually, he was inspired by how Chinese communists use comic books to spread propaganda. And Jack Chick was a very private, retiring person. He wasn't comfortable just approaching strangers and talking to them about his faith, but he wanted to do something. And so he thought, I'll just make these comics and I'll leave them places. He also was known for platforming some of the craziest evangelicals of the 1980s. I mentioned Rebecca Brown. Jack Chick published her books. And then he did a comic called Dark Dungeon about Dungeons and Dragons. And in that comic, the magic in Dungeons and Dragons actually works. When you get to a certain level, you just begin basically witchcraft and Satanism. And then if your character dies in the game, you commit suicide. So some of these teenagers are committing suicide in the track. And at the end, everybody burns all of their D&D books, and there is a pastor with this big handlebar mustache. And that pastor is supposed to be John Todd. John Todd went around the country saying that he was from an ancient family of witches, and that he was collecting money to bring more witches out of witchcraft into Christianity. And he seemed to keep vacillating between trying to actually be a Wiccan and going and sort of setting himself up in Wiccan communities, and then going and being an evangelical Christian fighting against witchcraft. And he was ultimately arrested for sexual assault and died in a mental institution. So again, when I say these people are quite literally unhinged, they are. But he was sort of Jack Chick's source for everything about Dungeons and Dragons in that comic. The other interesting thing about Dark Dungeons is in the original draft of the comic, it says, go home and burn all your D&D and fantasy books, including J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis.
Yes. Yeah.
And then in the later version, they deleted that bit about Tolkien and Lewis. They decided that they were okay.
Yeah. Yeah, they forgot they were Christians all of a sudden, and one of which considered, one of the best Christian apologists of the 20th century, probably not in league with things like that. Many of the tactics used in the panic by media ministries are still around today. So if someone's listening and they're wanting some kind of a working framework for identifying a panic-based ministry or panic-based platform, what are some telltale signs they should look for? And maybe to ask it another way, how can people avoid being swept away by a moral panic or leftovers or remnants from the satanic panic? How can they get some good tools to say, I don't think this is correct, or this feels like it's maybe somebody creating their own dark fantasy and who's operating under the Christian name, but may have some other things going on?
I mean, the number one thing I would say is Snopes.com. The website Snopes.com. If you hear something and it sounds like it might not be true, Snopes often has researched that thoroughly and can debunk it, or if it's true, they'll tell you the truthful basis of it. More broadly, there's a book by a sociologist named Stanley Cohen called Scapegoats and Moral Panics. He's one of the first sociologists to coin this term. And he says a good moral panic, it needs two things. It needs an innocent who's being threatened, right? So that the Satanists are never coming for the, straight, white, middle-class men. The Satanists are always coming for the women and the children. So that's a red flag if they say it's coming for our women or it's coming for our children. And then the second thing a moral panic needs is an enemy who can't fight back. So if someone is making claims about a group of people that actually doesn't seem to have a lot of power, and they're saying this group is a big threat, and that could be, Jews at various points in history, that could be teenagers, that's also a sign that it's a moral panic. And I would say a third thing is David Frankfurter in his book Evil Incarnate talks about this figure of the expert in evil, and this would include figures like John Todd and Rebecca Brown and William Schnoebelen, and in ancient times would include things like witch hunters. But these are people who say, I know these secret signs of evil that nobody else knows. And, you might see, a generic sort of corporate logo, but I can see all the satanic symbolism behind this. So when people claim they have kind of special symbolic knowledge about things, that's also a huge red flag.
Yeah, and it gets so tricky. And again, speaking just from a pastoral context, there are people who leave occult practices or change their beliefs about a number of different things, and many of them are very truthful, but we also have this whole genre. This goes back, to multiple moral panics. Even back to nativism in the early U.S. when you had stories that Protestants spun about Catholics, to create all kinds of suspicion. And we have this terrible genre as Christians, as people of faith, of just telling lies and creating our own dark, myths that demonize a group and then build up our own platforms. And so I don't want to minimize anyone who has a sincere story, but at the same time, I had an associate pastor who used to like to say, trust but verify, kind of a thing, like, okay, I want to listen to your story, but the wilder the claim, the more I'm going to need you to give me a little bit more. And it's just to be safe. As we've been sharing, there are so many stories of people who spin these tales, and they profit off of people's fear, off of their panic, off of their paranoia. They divert attention to real issues of mental well-being, and they destroy people. And we've talked about a couple who have been in jail for many years because of this. So unfortunately, we don't have a great track record with this. And I heard, being that it was recently October, and people are having the annual Halloween debates all over Facebook and social media, you can see people bringing out the tales where I used to be. And I was in the upper echelons of Freemasonry, and I have my mother's brother's cousin's nephew used to tell me, and all this kind of stuff comes out again. And it's a very strange genre, because again, you want to believe people are sincere, and yet we have many, many stories of people being sincerely wrong, and not just wrong, but wrong in a way that damages, people.
Yeah, and I've seen Christians who have kind of had the courage to speak up against this, and one thing they've said is, this is bearing a false witness, right? If you were not leading a satanic cult before you found Jesus, and you say you were, you're breaking one of the 10 commandments, right? You're bearing a false witness. The other thing they've said is, some cases this is kind of outright con artistry. It's an attempt to get money or something. But more often that it's the sin of pride, right? It's wanting people to think you have some special knowledge about the way the world really works that they don't. And that's coming from a place of pride, not a place of compassion or anything good.
So how did you get interested in this? The Dungeons and Dragons, Satanic Panic, what sort of flipped the switch? You're like, this needs to be studied. This is something I'm interested in.
Well, I grew up in the 1980s in Texas playing Dungeons and Dragons. And so I encountered all of this stuff growing up. And it was actually kind of my first realization that adults don't actually know everything, right? That they seem like they have all the answers, but they really have no idea how the world works. And as a religious studies major, I always knew there was something important I wanted to say about religion and role-playing games, but I really had to get my PhD in the sociology of religion before I could really articulate it. And so I did my dissertation, and I published that as a book. And then I could start up my second book, and I had a lot more freedom that I didn't have as a graduate student. And so I really decided this was what I wanted to do.
And I'm glad you did it. I mean, I've recommended your book, Dangerous Games, to several people because it's such a thorough and well documented, work on this subject. I mean, I've read different bits and pieces and articles from other people, and they're good, but this to me is really the textbook on it, and so many helpful stories, so many interesting comments on religion from a sociological standpoint, and very respectful. It's not, I really appreciated that as a person of faith. I didn't feel like I was being attacked, reading the book. It was just, hey, this is a period of history where some stuff went down, and it's not our finest moment, and we need to own that and do better. So when you were writing that book, did you run into any difficulty obtaining information, or did you find people pretty helpful? Of course, I'm thinking specifically of those legal documents that Patricia Pulling helped develop.
Yeah, a lot of the heavy lifting had already been done by the Committee for the Advancement of Role-Playing Games, and I just had to reach out to them, and they were the ones really in the 80s sort of doing all the hard work to get this stuff. So generally, I didn't have those kinds of problems. I wrote some inquiries to, the 700 Club, asking for transcripts and things like that were never answered. But generally, no, it wasn't too hard getting the archival sources that I needed to do this project.
So I'm thinking of a lot of our listeners who, they may be a person of faith, they may not be, but I know I can think of several listeners who have played Dungeons & Dragons, who might currently. What advice would you give to people who find themselves fielding questions or concerns about D&D or their involvement in D&D that are rooted in urban legends rather than facts?
Well, one thing that I really began to notice doing this project is there was this real fear of the imagination, that the imagination itself was something dangerous or opposed to God. And if you look at the history of Christianity, that's a complete 180 about how Christians have historically talked about it, right? Is that you can't see God with your eyes, but you can see God with your hearts. And the imagination is kind of a divine faculty and one of the ways in which God kind of makes himself known to human beings. So I guess my advice would be these conservative evangelicals, the ones that are critiquing Dungeons and Dragons, they're an anomaly within the history of the Christian tradition. They're not, they're not normative, right? They might have been normative in the 80s in the United States, but if you look back to Christian works, including things like, Dante's Inferno or any number of European mystics or things like this, or even figures like Plotinus in the classical world, that these are all people who saw the imagination as being a resource, not something dangerous. And I think if you're not coming from a place of fear, the imagination is seen as something good and not something dangerous.
Really quick, because I think you talk about this in the book, where did that fear of the imagination start creeping in? Where was there that shift where all of a sudden it was seen as dangerous? I know within my faith tradition, one of our key authors talks about the sanctified imagination. And even though that qualifier is put on there, it's still something very valued and celebrated. It's not something that is to be viewed with suspicion. So where do you see that shift where imagination suddenly becomes very suspect and dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, the most extreme versions of this is I found essays basically saying reality as it currently exists is exactly what God wants. And so fire engines are red because that's what God wants. And imagining a blue fire engine is blasphemous and defying God. At that level, I have to think this is just about control, right? This is just, you don't want people to be able to think for themselves or challenge the way things are. But I do think that there was sort of a trend in kind of literalism and sort of very, very kind of literal attempts to read the Bible that sort of discourage imagination and kind of having multiple readings of a text. I actually think the Victorians may have had a hand in this, with sort of framing the imagination as not being productive or sort of contributing to their ideas of industry and hard work and using your time effectively. So I don't really know, but I have a chapter where I sort of point to a number of historical moments where there seems to be this shift from the imagination is important, it's important for our faith, it's part of what makes us human, to the imagination is just bad and is almost satanic.
Well, I'm definitely going to recommend to our listeners to get the book Dangerous Games. We'll put that in the show notes. Dr. Laycock, thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom and insights with us.
Oh, this has been really fun. Thanks for having me.
Even though it pains me to say 1980, my birth year, was over 40 years ago, the stories told and the methods used by Christians in the Satanic Panic are still with us. Moral panics have been around for a long time, and each generation builds on panics of the past to condemn a variety of popular cultural artifacts or marginalized and vulnerable people. Going back to the witch-hunting panics in the Swiss Alps that were inspired by the Catholic Inquisitors and then picked up by Protestants and spread to England and the US, we can see that how under certain conditions believers can believe the very worst about their fellow human beings to the point of being willing to commit atrocities towards them, and in Christ's name. We also have a history of creating sensationalist media to convince people other believers are secretly a part of salacious, licentious, or diabolical practices. In 1836, a book entitled The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, or The Hidden Secrets of a Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed, claimed that all kinds of sexual abuse towards nuns and infanticide at the hands of Catholic priests were occurring every single day. It was later revealed that that was an anti-Catholic hoax that took off. It was a titillating, borderline pornographic tale able to be consumed by eager Christians because it allegedly exposed lies. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a repeat of the same dynamic with the allegedly ex-Satanist, often linked with Catholicism, testimonies. Published in books like former Christian comedian Mark Warnke's The Satan Seller, which was published in 1972, with Warnke exaggerating his claims in 1982 and then getting national exposure on 2020 in 1985. He was debunked as a fraud in 1991 with a troubling history of affairs and fabricating advanced degrees. As a result of the proliferation of these types of books in the 80s and the unhinged claims of a fundamentalist cartoonist named Jack Chick, who deserves his own episode for his monstrous influence, over 12,000 false claims of satanic ritual abuse were made that still have an effect on Christian sensitivity to possible occult conspiracies today. Because of this terrible tradition within our faith history, we need to be extremely careful to embrace these types of claims made by Christian media personalities, evangelists, or someone's uncle telling us wild tales about his time in the Freemasons. This is not meant to suggest there is no such thing as the occult, and no such thing as spiritual conflict between good and evil, or dangers in dabbling in dark practices. What these final episodes reveal is that Christians are just as susceptible to deception and spreading deception out of sincere but uncritically examined beliefs that are a product of cultural moments of fear and anxiety. I hope you've enjoyed this first season of Beast and Bible, and maybe true to Cohen's second thesis of monster theory, the podcast might escape and return if interest is high enough for a second season. For now, remember, even though God can feel scary sometimes, shattering our neat little categories we place the divine in, God loves each of us infinitely, even with all our weird quirks and sometimes monstrous behavior. Because of that, remember to treat others different from you with love and kindness. And in light of this final episode, remember Jesus tells us all to watch and pray and not watch and panic. Thank you for listening.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.